It's a pretty stark fact. The United States incarcerates more of its people than any other country on the planet. So today, we're going to dig into the story of how that happened over the last 40 years or so, and what the growing conversation around reform looks like. All right, hey everyone, and welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5340. That's Introduction to Public Policy and Management. We're tackling readings from Section 7, The Origins of Mass Incarceration and Sentencing Reform. And for this, we're going to be pulling out the key findings from some really important sources, major reports from the National Research Council, the bipartisan Brookings Institution and AEI, and this great collection of essays called Beyond Bars. So here's the game plan for today. First, we're going to look at the sheer scale of this prison boom. It's pretty mind-boggling. Then, we'll unpack the policies that actually got us here. After that, we'll get into the consequences, which are really widespread. And finally, we'll look at the path forward. What does reform look like? Okay, let's kick things off with the scale of this whole thing, because honestly, the numbers, they're just staggering. So get this. Right now, according to our sources, we're talking about nearly 2 million people in U.S. prisons and jails. And to put that in perspective, back in the early 1970s, that number was around 360,000. That's not just a jump, it's a colossal leap. So the big question is, what on earth changed? And this chart, which comes right out of the National Research Council report, really tells the whole story visually. Look at this. For half a century, the rate of imprisonment was incredibly stable, like flat. Then, right after 1972, it just skyrockets. This wasn't some slow, gradual trend. It was a sudden, really radical break from the past, driven by policy. Okay, so that leads to the next obvious question. How in the world did we get here? Well, one of the key takeaways from the NRC report is that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't just something that happened. It was driven by very specific policy choices. You can really see it happening in stages. So in the 70s, you get these new laws that fix prison terms. Then the 80s roll around and boom, harsh mandatory minimums, especially for drug crimes. And then in the 90s, we get truth in sentencing laws, which basically made sure inmates served almost their entire sentence, which, by the way, were already getting much, much longer. It was like each step just clicked a ratchet, making the system tighter and tighter. So let's zoom in on that first step for a second. Determinate sentencing. What does that even mean? Well, before this, a parole board usually had a lot of say in when you might get released. But with determinate sentencing, that sentence was pretty much fixed from day one. And what that did was shift a ton of power away from judges and parole boards and hand it right over to the legislators who were writing the laws and the prosecutors who were negotiating plea bargains. And you know, what's really striking is that some people saw exactly where this was all headed. There's this really powerful, almost haunting quote from 1993 from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan that's cited in the NRC report. He basically said that by choosing to prohibit drugs, we were also choosing to have a massive crime problem that would be concentrated among minorities. Think about that. The consequences weren't just foreseeable, they were literally being predicted out loud. So as you can imagine, the impact of all these policies didn't just stay inside the prison walls. No way. It created these massive ripple effects, sending shock waves through families and really entire communities. And maybe the most glaring consequence is the profound racial disparity it created. According to that same NRC report, the incarceration rate for Black men is 7 times higher than for white men. And listen to this statistic. For young Black men who are recent high school dropouts, an astonishing 2/3 have spent time in prison. It's become, tragically, almost a normal life event for a whole segment of the population. And the thing is, the punishment doesn't just stop when someone is released. Our sources talk a lot about something called collateral consequences. Basically, a criminal record becomes this permanent barrier, blocking people from getting jobs, finding stable housing, getting public benefits, even taking away their right to vote. They're like these legal roadblocks that make it incredibly difficult to actually rejoin society. The Beyond Bars collection points to another huge barrier, something called legal financial obligations, or LFOs. Think of these as court fees, fines, and restitution that can just bury people in debt. And if you can't pay, well, you could lose your driver's license or, in some cases, even get sent back to jail. It creates what the authors call a two-tiered system of justice, one for people who can afford to pay their way out and one for those who can't. So what about the kids? What's the toll on the next generation? The findings from the National Research Council here are, well, they're really sobering. When a father is incarcerated, it's directly linked to things like behavioral problems in his children. It puts a huge strain on the family's finances and creates this instability that can literally last a lifetime. So, here we are after 4 decades of this. And there's this growing consensus from all sides, really, that the system is broken. So, what does a better path forward actually look like? Well, our sources offer some pretty clear directions. At the heart of all these reform ideas is a really fundamental shift in philosophy. The old model was all about punishment and this idea of just desserts. You do the crime, you do the time, end of story. The new consensus, though, argues for a pivot toward rehabilitation. That means focusing on the root causes of crime, and really importantly, actively helping people succeed once they get out. So that bipartisan group from Brookings and AEI, they lay out some really key reforms. They start with accountability, things like reforming qualified immunity for officers and setting national de-escalation standards. Then they look inside the prisons themselves, suggesting we should tie federal funding to how well a prison is actually doing at rehabilitation. And finally, they focus on reentry, saying we need to eliminate most of those collateral consequences we talked about, the things that stop people from being able to rebuild their lives. And Beyond Bars gets even more specific on what it takes to rebuild lives. First, reform those crushing financial sanctions, the LFOs, modernize the parole process using practices that are actually proven to work, and this is crucial, they say we need to invest in the two things that have been shown again and again to reduce the chances of someone going back to prison: access to higher education while in prison, and real support for stable housing and employment once they're released. And all of this really brings us to the final big question that these sources kind of force us to ask. After this 40-year experiment with mass incarceration, what should the true purpose of a prison be? Is it just about punishment? Or is it maybe about making our communities safer by making sure that when people get out, they actually come out better, not worse? How we answer that question, well, that's really going to define the next era of justice in America.